The grand vision for the skyline of Melbourne.
We are absolutely determined to build more homes for more Victorians.
Shame, Premier, shame!
Has become a battle for the city's suburbs.
Are people prepared to put up with this? It's wrong.
I can't even understand how it's going to work.
As part of the government's ambitious commitment to deliver 800,000 homes in a decade, it's now paving the way for residential towers up to 20 storeys high to be built in suburban hubs close to public transport, known as activity centres.
That's why I'm a builder, not a blocker.
Why would you pull down what makes Melbourne such an interesting, attractive, livable city?
As part of this policy, the government has stripped away some powers from council and will fast-track planning permits to make it easier for developers to build as quickly as possible. But that's concerned some residents, experts and members of the federal parliament who say there's a worrying lack of detail in a proposal that promises to change the face of the city.
There's very little detail about how that might work, what the timing of things being rolled out might be, what other infrastructure is being thought about, planned.
Well, the government's really engaged in a massive city rebuilding project where it's really proposing to demolish a substantial part of the established city and to rebuild it. Around 60 core areas in the activity centres around rail stations and shopping centres. That would be high-rise to 20 storeys, and then an area about 800-metre radius away from those activity centres to 6 storeys.
The risk is that we get bad development in residential areas and we don't get the infrastructure support.
These Melbourne residents, all active in their local community, say they're affected by the proposed plans, and they took part earlier this year in the government's consultation process.
We've done more in informing our community about what these activity centres and catchments are than the government's ever done.
Stacey Harley lives in the leafy northwestern suburb of Essendon, where about 10,000 new dwellings are planned for her area.
Stacey, are you opposed to housing? And in other words, are you a NIMBY because you oppose this?
I'm absolutely not a NIMBY. And I live in a great area, and of course people want to live there. But right now, we can't have anyone come in because we don't have the infrastructure to currently support our community.
So the population goes up without the funding to support it. So we don't have the community health centres, the aged care, the green spaces to allow for 70% more population.
Michael Buxton spent 12 years working for the Victorian government's planning department and is now one of the nation's leading urban development academics.
We're going to end up with a city that is boring, that isn't going to work, that will lead to incredible traffic congestion, and we'll lose that interesting edge that makes Melbourne such a wonderful place.
So what we need to do is work with community, work with industry, work with local government about how can we unlock these areas that are really well serviced.
A great place for more homes. A great place for more homes. A great place for more homes.
The government says in addition to community forums, it consulted widely with residents through letter drops, online surveys and social media posts. But these residents say it was window dressing.
The community reference group, in our case in Moorabbin, consisted of about 12 people who met twice for 5 hours. And it was guided discussion, so we were not allowed to talk about types of apartments, the need for apartments, the speed of apartments. So all those things were outside the boundary of the discussion. It was all about how do you make the plan work.
I submitted more than 70 questions on notice in the what, why, how categories. More than 2 months on, I have not received a single answer to a question.
I think that if you're going to run something like a reference group, it's important to actually listen to what people are saying.
And throughout the process, they say they were kept in the dark over where the proposed towers will be built. They say the initial plan indicated they'd be situated next to public transport.
It was only towards the end of the process in late August that the plan dropped, and we saw these plans for 6-storey apartment buildings a kilometre from the train stations.
We got 10,000 community responses. It's probably the largest response we've ever had on an engagement of that nature, which suggests to me that people are engaged. They want to talk about their communities.
The government believes this proposed building blitz will deliver affordable housing. But developers, who the government is relying on to build these activity centres, say the numbers don't stack up.
And so right now there's about a 30% difference between what the market's prepared to pay for a unit and what developers now need to sell it for it to be a feasible development. So it's just not happening.
Developer Max Schiffman says the cost of building in Victoria is currently so high, the government will struggle to entice any developers to build the activity centres. And even if they do, the housing delivered won't be affordable.
For a normal, call it apartment in Melbourne now, a developer needs to be selling that for around $14,000 a square metre for the end product to be viable. And if you translate that into a modestly sized 3-bedroom unit, and 3 bedrooms are still where the bulk of the market is for new housing, then that translates into roughly $1.4 to $1.5 million for that house.
The original planning for places like Docklands and Southbank was to create really high quality livable suburbs, low to medium rise housing with European model of development.
This vista is proof, Michael Buxton says, that government hasn't learned from mistakes of the past.
We ended up with high rise and the development industry making the decisions about what goes where. Now, what the Premier is doing is putting that approach on steroids for the entire city of Melbourne in the established, particularly the established suburbs.
It's completely wrong, completely wrong. My focus is on building communities and providing opportunity for more Victorians, particularly young Victorians, to be able to buy or rent a place where they want to live. And where do people want to live? They want to live in communities that have great access to public transport, that have wonderful parks, open spaces, trees, services, schools.
Last year, the federal government announced an accord with the states to fund more housing to address the crisis. Monique Ryan, whose electorate of Kooyong is earmarked for one of the first activity centres, is calling for greater scrutiny.
State government can't be allowed to just act on these things without any external input. Federal government obviously has a financial stake in it, and so it's the obvious thing to do for someone like me is to ask the federal government to help intervene in this situation and get the action at a community level that we're looking for.
Despite the concerns, the government is undeterred and sees activity centres as Melbourne's future.
What we're doing is about fairness and about setting up Victoria to be a fairer future.